Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce this final session. I'm Chris Peacocke, a philosopher who's learned a lot from having participated in this program. We have in this final session one current scholar, Paul Linton, and we have one of our early ones, Matteo Farinella, both working in a sense with vision and sight, but with utterly different theoretical and practical concerns. For Paul's talk, you should have 3 of these glasses. They're available. If you haven't got any, please make sure you have some before Paul talks, which he will begin now. Paul, please.
Great. So everyone can hear me okay? Thanks so much, Chris. Good. So the title for today's talk is Four Illusions Challenge Our Understanding of Visual Experience. And what I want to really suggest is that we seem to have fundamentally understood some really important aspects of visual experience. And the particular claim I'm going to make today is that visual experience is a lot simpler than we previously thought. So in order to make that claim, the very first thing I need to do is define or make sense of what we mean by visual experience. So I want to give you a thought experiment. So imagine you're looking at a car, a real-world car or a stereo car, so you can utilize your stereo glasses now. Or you're looking at a picture of the very same car, right? The fact is you can make many of the same judgments, okay? And yet your visual experience of these two things side by side is completely different, right? Is radically different. And the worry for psychology and neuroscience, however, is that where psychology and neuroscience focus is on the judgments, right? And so you won't be able to pick up on that subtle or profound difference in visual experience. And that's the key concern that my work's focused on. Indeed, in a recent paper I wrote, whilst we want a theory of real-world 3D vision, the literature risks giving us a theory of picture perception instead. Good. So why is this of interest to the PSSN? Well, because these kinds of distinctions are exactly the kinds of distinctions that philosophers have been engaging with for decades. Indeed, probably the best sort of discussion of these issues is Chris Peacocke's Sense and Content. So you jump in at chapter 1 and immediately it hits us, right? This distinction between sensation and the content of experience. And he goes on to discuss the subtle differences that arise from having stereo vision versus monocular vision. So Chris has been my philosophy mentor, and I've also benefited immensely from working with David Friedberg at the Italian Academy, who comes from art history. And so the basic question is this, if art history and philosophy are interested in visual experience, how are we going to make it tractable for psychology and neuroscience? And this is where Nico Krieger-Skorte comes in. So that's the mission statement. Can we make visual experience tractable for psychology and neuroscience? And so what you might suggest is, well, look, it's pretty easy. Just ask observers about their visual experience, okay? But the argument of my book, and indeed of this talk, is that often people mistake their judgments for their visual experience. And so a key part of my work in Nico's lab is to try and find ways of illustrating this by developing illusions that highlight that people are mistaking their judgments for their visual experience. Good. So we're going to look at 4 topics today, each with their own illusion: visual inference, visual shape, visual scale, and visual consciousness. And all 4 are basically trying to more experimentally test the hypotheses and theory in my initial more theoretical philosophical work on a new approach to visual scale and visual shape. So this was at the very beginning of my time at PSSN year 1, where we launched this Royal Society volume and had an event here at the Zuckerman. Great. So to jump in, let's start with the question of visual inference. And really, this is the question, what is visual perception, right? So if you ask this question in the 1970s, you basically had 2 options. One is to say it's largely sort of bottom-up sensory driven. So if you want to know about 3D shape, you just ask about stereo vision. That comes from Ulesh. But the other is to say, well, look, no, it's actually top-down, grounded in a lot of our sort of knowledge and expectations about the environment. And essentially, our visual perception is our best guess about the world. It comes from Richard Gregory and others, but Richard Gregory had one key example that I think really helped to sell this account, and that was the hollow face illusion. Right? So the hollow face illusion, you show a hollow face, right? It's protruding away from you, but it looks like it's protruding towards you, leading to these weird sort of non-rigid motion effects. Great, so if the reality is like this, your percept, so the account goes, is like this. Good, so I completely agree with that as an account of the hollow face illusion as you're viewing it today on a screen, right? But the question is this really a good account of the question that I'm interested in, which is our experience of this 3D space out in the world, rather than picture perception? And so that leads us to the first illusion I'm going to discuss, the unhollow face illusion. So, of course, people have tried the hollow face illusion in real life, right? And people do experience it. So the reality is like this, and they say their perception's like this. So their judgments are like that. But is their visual experience really like that, right? That's the fundamental question. And so the purpose of this illusion is to just make a subtle manipulation that I think is very, very important, which is to introduce a physical object into the hollow of the hollow face, right? Because this is space that exists according to the physical object as a hollow face, after all, but it shouldn't exist according to the illusion, right? Because everything's inverted. So what's going to happen if we do this? So one thing you might think is, well, you know, space really is inverted, then the physical object has to be seen behind the hollow face has to be seen as sort of transparent, something like that. I could buy that account. But the problem is, if we see the physical object in front of the hollow face, while still experiencing the illusion, it becomes pretty difficult to maintain that we're actually having a perceived inversion of 3D space, right? Good, so who wants to try it? So I'm gonna give you this version first. This is pretty rubbish, so I've set it up on this TV, so we'll also try that. So this display is washed out. This one is a bit better. But basically, what I want to claim. Sorry. Oh, red over your left eye, and you should put all three on top of each other. Sorry. So red over left eye. Right, so you're still, if you look at the one on TV or even the one on the screen, you're still getting the illusion, you're getting the illusory motion of the nose. So you haven't lost the illusion. But at the same time, I would argue you can quite vividly see the veridical depth between these scaffolding poles and the illusion behind it, right? There doesn't seem to be an inversion of stereo depth, even though the illusion is still persisting. Right? Should we go on to a second version of this? Are we ready for that? Right? Oh, I forget, it's just on that one. So here again, so this is closer to the example I showed you in the schematic diagram, right? You really have an object filling the hollow, you've got points on the nose and on the cheek. And I think you can get a veridical sense of the stereo depth in the stimulus without breaking the illusion. So that's really interesting. Good. So I'll leave that one on that screen and we'll continue the talk over here. So that's about visual inference, right? What kind of properties, what ways of thinking about vision we should be looking at? And in my heart of hearts, I find myself, when I talk about visual shape, back towards the Eulesh position, right? That it really is stereo vision that's driving a lot of these things rather than the richer, more cognitive Gregory position. But if that's true, then the second question you want to ask is, well, how do we get 3D shape from stereo vision, right? That's a sort of natural question. And here we don't have to go to the 1960s, right? We can go to the 1600s. So Descartes argued, well, look, vision is an optics problem from points in the world to points in the retina. So perception itself must be an inverse optics problem. So we go from points in the retina back out into points in the world, right? And this is pretty much the account that you'll see in much of the literature today. But the key thing you have to realize about this account is that it has a hidden component, right, that translates from retinal coordinates to world coordinates. So imagine I have a 10 centimeter separation and I'm moving it backwards and forwards in space, right? Its retinal projections, the disparities in the two eyes are going to be much, much larger as I get closer than further away. And so there has to be this mechanism that converts from retinal disparities back into world coordinates to give you that constant sense of a separation in depth as it moves through space. Good. But we've got basically 60 years plus of literature, experimental literature testing this and finding such a mechanism. It's called stereo depth constancy. It's thought to be a fundamental aspect of our visual experience. And I guess that's what I want to challenge with the Linton stereo illusion. So the illusion is very, very simple, right? We have two conditions that start off in exactly the same way. We have a back circle at 50 centimeters and a front circle at 40 centimeters, right? So we've got our 10 centimeter separation. And all we're going to do is move it towards us and away from ourselves. Right? But in one condition on the left, we keep the separation constant. On the other condition on the right, we compress the separation as it comes towards us in order to keep the retinal disparities and not the physical distance constant. And so the question for you all is, well, in which of these two conditions do you think it's actually your percept, your actual visual experience, is going to look like the one on the left, where we actually keep it constant, where everything looks like it's moving through depth together? And the answer we find is actually it's the one where we match the disparities, right? There doesn't seem to be a mechanism that goes from this back out to the world coordinates, right? So if we do the one on the left, people see this huge concertina effect. Whilst if we do the one on the right, even though it's physically compressing, in their experience, they see it as moving rigidly. That's the claim, at least. So should we give it a shot? Okay. So here it is on the screen. So the one on the left is the one where you keep the physical distance 10 centimeters constant. Most people report you've got a pretty strong concertina effect coming from that. Right? It doesn't seem to be rigid, whilst the one on the right seems to move relatively rigidly. And that's simply where you just keep the disparities constant. Good. So I'm going to keep it on the TV and press on. So that was taken to the Vision Sciences Society in Florida last year. So you've got Marty Banks from Berkeley, Michael Andy from NYU. Papers should be coming out fairly shortly. Good. So those are the first two topics, and so far we've very much focused on this question of 3D shape, right? So different sources of 3D shape information, and then if we just look at stereo vision, how we extract 3D shape from that. But my PhD work and one of my sort of long-term interests is on visual scale, so the size and distance of objects. And what I want to claim about visual scale, which is probably the most controversial claim in the talk, is that it doesn't seem that our visual experience gives us a direct impression, immediate impression of the size and distance of objects. So what do I mean by that? Because it's a controversial claim, so I've got to spell it out pretty well. So it goes back to this distinction between wanting a theory of real-world 3D vision versus just having a theory of picture perception instead, right? So clearly when you're watching a TV show or film show, you get an impression of the size and distance of objects in the TV show, right? But what you don't get is an immediate sense that the objects in the show are 30 centimeters from you or 3 meters from you or 30 meters, right? There's no sense it's actually inhibiting the space surrounding you. By contrast, you'd want to say that in everyday vision, you really have that immediate sense of the absolute distance of objects, okay? And what I want to try and convince you of today is actually our real-world sense of scale is a lot closer to this, the TV case, than we appreciate. So that's the claim, and we'll see how far we get with that. So what would lead me to this conclusion? Well, it's a contraption that Helmholtz invented in the 1850s, known as the telestereoscope. And he observed if you increase the separation between the eyes, right, the world seems miniature. It seems, as he said, as if the observer is not looking at the natural landscape itself, but a very exquisite and exact model of it reduced in scale. Good. And what's really important to notice about this example is that all your other absolute distance cues, all your other size and distance cues are maintained, they're veridical, and yet you see the wrong scale. So it suggests that whatever's determining the wrong scale in this case also determines how you see right scale in everyday viewing. Good. Now, for Helmholtz, the answer was simple, right? It's that you're changing the optical path of this object. So if you're looking at the black dot, the optical path is now the red dot, and so of course it looks closer and smaller. But my PhD work is very much focused on saying, well, actually it doesn't seem that the visual system has access to those kind of triangulation mechanisms from my rotation. Indeed, if you look at the raw data of people trying to point using that mechanism, right, to the distance of a point of light in darkness, they're basically guessing. So I don't think this sort of immediate sense of eye rotation to fixate on points in the world is going to explain it. But we still need an explanation. And so where I find myself going is to suggest that it's solely grounded in distortions of 3D shape. Okay. Why is this? Well, when you look at a far object in the world, the difference in the two retinal images are fairly small. Okay. But with the telestereoscope, now the differences between the two retinal images are large, and the brain interprets this as accentuated 3D shape. So here's a quote from Oliver Sacks. When he used a telestereoscope, I could look at even distance objects, like the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, which normally appeared as a flat semicircle, and see it in its full rotundity. Good. And I think that's really all that the telestereoscope is effectively doing. It's not messing with the immediate distance that objects are perceived. Instead, all it's messing with is your perception of 3D shape. Right? But now it becomes a real challenge to explain why messing with your perception of 3D shape should lead to the impression of miniaturization that people since Helmholtz and others have discussed. And that's where I rely on a cognitive association between vivid stereo depth, so that sense of accentuated 3D shape, and closer distances, given our experience of an environment where disparity, that's the differences between the two eyes, fall very rapidly off with distance. Okay. So a lot of that was my theoretical work, and so what I've been working on in Nico's lab is another illusion. And unfortunately, I can't show it to you because it's a virtual reality illusion rather than a one you put on the screen, is ways of testing decoupling 3D shape cues and distance cues to see if this effect is really true, if the hypothesis is correct. So in normal viewing, you've got both normal distance and 3D shape. In telestereoscopic viewing, you have 3D shape and distance telling you the world is small. Right. But I've come up with different ways of rendering the scene that we can discuss that enable us to test this quadrant, for instance, right? Distance cues say that the world is small, 3D shape cues say that the world is normal, and it turns out it looks pretty normal, right? Whilst if you go in the other direction, have 3D shape cues say it's small, but distance cues say it's normal, turns out it looks pretty small, okay? And so really it does seem to be this distortion of 3D shape that's driving the effect in the telestereoscope and potentially our impression of scale overall. Good. So I've just got 3 minutes to solve visual consciousness, so we're going to do this nice and quickly. But another thing I'm working on with Nico is this generative adversarial collaboration on is V1 a cognitive map. And V1, for those who don't know, is, so if light hits the retina, goes to LGN, then goes to primary visual cortex V1. V1 is thought of as like a map of the retina in your cortex, right? Like a little picture. People will argue with that. And then the question is, well, what's V1's relationship to visual experience? Because you often think our visual experience isn't just a picture of our retina. So take these illusions, right? People say, look, even though these cars are the same size on your retina, your perception is that the back car is much bigger than the one in front. And I have to be very clear, this is someone else's illusion, right? So I can't take credit for this, okay. But what I'm trying to push with the manipulation of this illusion is to question whether that really is the right account of what's going on here, right? Because what seems to be suggested in literature is something like this, right? What's happening in different parts of your visual field, which is the sort of height and width of what you see, is they're being pulled and stretched. And I can talk about the details of all that. A bit like in graphics processing, where you pull and stretch pixels in an image, okay? But what about in this case? So that account predicts that anything you introduce in a space in the picture should be equally distorted as it's pulled and contracted, if that's the real right way of thinking about it, which is the way the literature thinks about it. And yet most people argue that, seem to get the impression that the rectangles are less distorted than the cars, right? And if that's the case, then that can't be the account. And furthermore, if you believe the rectangles are really not that distorted, actually, they seem pretty even, then you're getting yourself back to saying that actually in the context of this illusion, we seem much closer to our retinal image than people previously thought. Good. So that's 19 minutes. All that's left is to sum up by saying I've given you 4 illusions that challenge our understanding of visual experience. We'll see how convinced you are in the questions and answers. They've covered visual inference, visual shape, visual scale, and visual consciousness. And all that's left is to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone at PSSN. So Pamela, Carol, my mentors, Nico and Chris, Joseph, Caroline, Tamara, and Maddie. Thank you to everyone at the Italian Academy and David Freeberg, and also to the NOMIS Foundation, who are currently funding me. And then, of course, thank you to everyone here at the Zuckerman Institute, so Daphne, Carol, Melinda, Mitali, and the Krieger Scorter Lab. Thank you.
We're actually quite pressed for time, so we'll take questions collectively at the end. Move on to Matteo Farinella, who was a PSSN postdoctoral fellow in 2016 to 2019, and then, by a wonderful transition, became media director for the Zuckerman Institute. Is that correct? Matteo, please.
I'll tell you more about that.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. If you stayed the whole day or if you just joined. Yeah, it's both a honor and a daunting task to end this day with, it's probably going to be the least scientific presentation, but I didn't actually, yeah, I don't have a summary of my PSSN years, but in case you haven't met me before, my background is in neuroscience, but after my PhD, I left research and I spent a few years working as a freelance illustrator and science communicator. And so when I came to PSSN, my goal was really to kind of combine the two and try to take a step back and use a bit of more like psychology and cognitive science to study what I was doing. In particular, I was really interested in comics. That's my passion. That's what I did. I published a few comics, both for adults and for children. And yeah, I wanted to know like what do comics have to offer for science communication. And yeah, it was amazing. Those 3 years, like I really got, I feel like it was like a second PhD, a second training in science communication. And, but at the end of it, I wasn't quite sure what to do because I realized also at the end of the day, I really enjoy drawing the comics more than studying them. And I was very lucky because literally like the last few months of my postdoc, the Zuckerman Institute advertised a new position as a scientific multimedia producer. And yeah, it was kind of like the perfect fit for me. So I haven't gone very far. I've been here ever since. And I work here. It's very nice to see all my former colleagues here. In the past 5 years, I think I got to work with most of the labs in the Institute and a lot of the scientists that kind of guided me and inspired me during the PSSN years. And my job is to help them with whatever visual needs they have. I'm not doing it alone. I'm part of the communication team. So we also have like a science writer and video maker. And our job is to take all the amazing science that is happening at the Institute, which is already published in like the best journals, but is not always the most accessible to non-scientists, and turn into something, yeah, a bit more appealing for non-experts. So from traditional press releases to Q&As, documentaries, and in my case, animations and illustrations. And I really expanded my repertoire here. I also started doing more like traditional scientific diagrams, graphic abstracts. I do journal covers and illustrations. When scientists discover them here, they really enjoy doing the covers. And yeah, I also, when I have more time, I started doing some animations to explain some of the more complex research going on here. And to be honest, I wasn't really pushing for comics. Actually, I feel like I got lucky having this job, so I wasn't trying to push my agenda too much. But over the years, I actually have to give credit to my colleagues at the communication team. They are the one who suggested to do these comic strips about people here at the Institute. So we were trying to find a way to cover not just, just PIs and the latest research, but also more junior researchers, also PhDs and postdocs. And so we came up with this idea of the science life, which is like very brief origin stories of why people do what they do. And yeah, it was very popular. We got now over 40 stories, I think, on the website. People really liked it. And we also got a prize, a special mention, 2023, from the, I think it was the Association of Science Writers. So yeah, it was very surprising and pleasant to me that, like, actually the only comics I did at the Institute were one of the things that were most appreciated. And also, yeah, we'd also do these explainers. We turned this one into a short animation. And this one also got a prize from Nature Science Shorts Award last year. So again, like, I feel like in a way, like what I set up to prove with some theory, like it's already happening. Like, people do appreciate comics. Scientists want to use comics. In fact, I still do some freelance work, and over the years, many institutions reach out to me asking specifically for comics. I did comics for the NIH, for the University of California, for this, recently this Austrian team for transition to open access. And yeah, like, comics have been becoming more and more established, I feel. I'm often invited to talk about comics in science communication. And in my little free time, I also volunteer on a few organizations, like I'm on the editorial board of Graphic Mundi, which is an offshoot of Penn State University Press, which specializes in graphic nonfiction. I'm a guest editor for Crucial Comics, which is a new platform for nonfiction comics. So again, like, this thing I kind of set up to convince scientists of is already happening. And yeah, the downside of that is, like, I'm not getting to do much scholarship. And so what I'm trying to do now, it's whenever I'm asked to write a paper or write a book chapter, which still happens once in a while, I usually say no, because, again, I don't have time, and it's not really, like, part of my job. But I started more recently I want to push for graphic scholarship. So my answer is now, like, I'll do it if you let me do it in a comic format, because that's, like, my preferred format. And surprisingly, recently, somebody agreed. So there's this upcoming book called Pictologic about kind of the theory and logic behind visual communication and design. And they agreed to let me do a chapter in comic format, kind of summarizing everything I learned here. And this is still unpublished. This is literally how I spent my winter holidays. So it's all very new. Nobody has seen it except the editors. But I just wanted to read it here for you, because the PSSN always encouraged me to do new things, and I figure it's the best place to get some feedback. And it's not very long, don't worry. I really try to put most of the information in the visuals. Are the questions, like whether I'm going to actually be able to see it? Okay. So comics have come a long way from their humble origins as Sunday comic strips. And over the past decades, cartoonists have successfully tackled more adult nonfiction topics. And today comics are, as I was saying, they are very popular for medical and scientific communication. These comics aim to make complex subject matter more accessible and engaging to non-specialized audiences. But beyond their apparent simplicity, comics, I think, actually involve very elaborate cognitive processes. And it's important to understand this medium to design comic effectively. So what makes a good science comics? That's kind of the question I've been trying to answer. Most people still think of comics as just words accompanied by pictures. And as a result, many comics are still linear. They are like watching a movie or reading a text or a lecture, which it's not very exciting. Exaggerated physical gestures and the shape of balloons or other comic symbolism can be used to recreate nonverbal cues that we use in everyday communication. And you can see I use those a lot, so that's useful. But these pictures don't really add much to the conversation, and they're mostly ornamental. And it can get kind of boring after a while if it's this panel after panel thing. In my opinion, one of the most useful things comic can do is to push us into the realm of visual thinking. In her book, Visual Thinking, engineer and neurodiversity advocate Temple Grandin argues that word-based thinking is sequential and linear. People who are primarily verbal thinkers tend to comprehend things in order, which is why they tend to do well in school, where learning is mostly structured sequentially and text-based. Visual thinkers, on the other hand, see images in their mind's eye, and that allows them to make rapid-fire associations. Visual thinking allows us to look at things from new perspectives, which according to Grandin is at the root of innovation. And comics combine the best of both worlds. They are both linear, you can read them one panel at a time, and non-linear, you can see them all at once. I started to think of comic panels as members of an ecosystem who have separate lives, but they're also connected at a deeper level. Comic scholar Morlesi Melado described this as a tension between looking and seeing, between capturing all the image at once and focusing on a particular one. According to Nick Souzanis, another great comic scholar, was actually here at Teachers College, comic combine the fundamentally two different ways of attending the world, the sequential of the left brain and simultaneous of the right brain. The left brain breaks down and isolates information into segmented parts, and the right addresses the whole in its context. My mentor, Barbara Tversky, taught us that space can be often used to organize our thoughts. And comic scholars like Gronstein and McLeod also argue that the layout of a comic page is just as important as the writing and the drawings. Like a well-designed museum, a comic page can recapitulate information, but also leave space for serendipitous discoveries. Just like a diagram, a comic can use shape and color to connect ideas across the page. And I think this is particularly relevant in science, when we are often required to draw connections between different temporal or spatial scales. Comics also have a very unique relationship to time, because on the same page, past, present, and future can coexist in a comic. And if you haven't seen, the comic here by Richard McGuire is a great example. Panels allow us to break down actions into simple steps, easy to follow, while the size of a panel can be used to convey a sense of duration. Comic artist and educator Jin Yang claims that the permanency of comics allows different readers to absorb the information at their own pace, like text, but they can also be easily reread multiple times, unlike animation. And all these properties make comics an ideal medium for storytelling. I usually show this animation by psychologist Heider Simmel, who did this very classic experiment in 1944. They showed this video, this animation of geometric shapes moving around on a screen. And they found that most people reported seeing human-like agency in these shapes. And this was taken as a scientific demonstration of the human instinct to project human emotions onto inanimate objects or natural elements, which is something that, of course, cultures around the world always did. And storytelling today is understood as a universal way of understanding the world, not just as a form of entertainment. So storytelling can be very powerful in science communication, and this is something that every journalist and science writer understands. The problem is that to tell stories, you need characters. The most obvious solution is to focus on the scientists themselves, making them the heroes. The risk here is, of course, to oversimplify the scientific process, overemphasizing individual contributions over collaborations, and reinforcing stereotypes, who gets to do science. Also, science pushes us often beyond the human scale of existence, and it becomes increasingly harder to find a protagonist when you get to the very large or the very small. And here comics can exploit our innate pareidolia, this tendency we have to see faces everywhere, to turn these distant concepts into relatable characters. McLeod again argues that these simplified or iconic characters have more universal appeal because readers can find them relatable regardless of their background. These stories can be particularly useful when science requires us to understand systems whose effects may be felt across great distances in space or time, which I think is very hard to do with text. These anthropomorphizing of scientific entities, of course, can draw the reader into these challenging subjects, but also project human-like agency where there is none. So when I draw a neuron as a character, it's kind of a tricky thing, right? Because of course, neurons don't have hands and feet, but what I'm trying to show is that neurons communicate with each other. So in that case, can be useful. So these visual metaphors, I start to think of them as a microscope. They can bring into focus some concepts, but also blur others. Gentner and Brown are scholars that suggested that metaphors are particularly useful in science when we are dealing with new invisible entities. So we can use familiar concepts as a map or scaffold to approach new domains. So finally, I want to conclude with some practical advice for scientists that want to use comics or collaborate with comic artists. And the first one I always tell them is to slow down. I know it's hard, but comics have many advantages, but speed is not one of them. It takes a lot of time to make a comic because, as I hope I show you, there are many things to consider, many choices to be made. So yeah, plan ahead and allow for plenty of time to sketch and brainstorm. Number two, collaborate. Unless you're a scientist that also draw a comic, which is pretty rare, comics are by definition multidisciplinary. They require multiple people to work together. And so I always encourage, especially scientists, to respect different kind of expertise and be open to new ideas. Because of course, accuracy is important, but scientists should trust the intuition of the artist when it comes to things like characters and storytelling. Finally, consider your audience. If you are making comics, it's probably because you want to reach beyond your academic bubble. So try to think about the people you are trying to engage. What are they interested in? What are their values and their backgrounds? And on this front, yeah, metaphors sometimes don't translate well across cultures, like Annie's baseball metaphors. It's completely lost on me. So yeah, I often try to look for metaphors more based in the natural world, the things we all share. Yeah, and finally, remember that the power of comics lies in the visual component. So I always try to strip down the text with bare minimum and try to convey as much information as possible through the drawings. Ideally, visuals should do more than just repeat the text. They can add nuance and new layers of meaning and express ideas that are difficult to otherwise capture with words. And I don't even have a thank you slide, but of course, thank you to everybody at the PSSN program that encouraged me to do things like this. And thank you all for being here.
I'm sure there's some lessons there too for us in designing PowerPoint slides as well. Okay, any questions, please? Mike.
This is a question for Paul. I enjoyed both talks, really. I was wondering if in your talk, it was very compelling as an evidence, but it felt like you were doing something that philosophers often do, which is kind of putting two strawmans one against the other. And I was thinking that when you think about these illusions, what some psychologists think about, for example, intuitive physics. So you have the physical world and the way it behaves, but then we have a representation in our mind, which is kind of a simplified caricature, which allows us to make fast computation in our mind, and we can run this through. And I think a lot of the illusion can be explained from this kind of combination of heuristics that are kind of quick to do and the real world inference. So you don't need to really infer the vertical distributions. You can kind of like bootstrap with this some kind of simplified intuitive perception, and then it's not that surprising.
Sure. Is this on? Can everyone hear? Yeah, brilliant. So there's two things there. One is when we think about 3D vision, should it really be aiming to reconstruct a veridical map of the 3D world? So I completely agree with you, right? I don't think that's the case. And so that really was the sort of force behind the Royal Society volume, New Approaches to 3D Vision, where these new approaches were ones that moved away from that. So I'm within that family of ways of thinking about 3D vision. Within that family, though, I do take a slightly harder stance on many of these, eliding these questions between experience and judgment. I think, you know, if you want to convince me that perspective and shading cues are really flipping the hollow face in perceived 3D stereo space, it's going to have to be these kinds of tests, right? I don't think it's a straw man to say that the claim in the literature has been that you literally had a perceptual inversion, and I'm turning around and saying, well, not so quickly. This is not convincing me.
Thanks a lot. Also a question for Paul. Just how you account for movement in your consideration of vision, the fact that we are also able to, in some sense, control our visual percepts, I don't know if the right word is percept, sensations, by moving around the world, and if that factors into the way that you conceive and model these problems.
Sure, it's a good question. It's an aspect that I haven't really focused on as much, and the reason for that is, although the information is there to provide us, I'm thinking particularly about the visual scale context, the information is there to give us an absolute impression of distance. A lot of people have done the movement case with early virtual reality and didn't find a very strong signal, like a surprisingly weak signal. That said, I don't null it out when I give people the visual scale thing. So if that was an appropriate cue, it would be there, but for myself, you know, I like to test people sitting down, but I also think that's a perfectly legitimate way to test people. So I look at some of the motion literature, and they have an interesting description of their stimuli and the way they get people to interact with the world, which is literally like swaying back and forth, and then make a judgment about how far things are, and a complete mile away from how we actually interact with the world, right? So my impression is the doors open on the elevators to the 9th floor. I immediately have an impression of visual scale. Maybe that's some minor motion parallax, maybe not, but it isn't the kind of stuff that's traditionally been studied in the literature.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for another wonderful panel. So Matteo, I thought your pictologic article was very useful. I'm thinking about, you know, you said comics are good for storytelling, but you need a character, and this has some, you know, problems as well, some pitfalls as well as, you know, potential for how to do it. I wonder, though, whether there are aspects of comics, you know, kind of like poetry that focuses the emotions or responds to certain kinds of vaguer ideas that people have. But let me just ask you whether you could make whether you think that comics could actually kind of inspire further scientific questions, so that comics can become part of the science. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You know, I can imagine if you made, say, the tools and instruments the interlocutors, what kinds of questions would that raise, a la Netta Namati's talk, for example? Or if you made kind of the examination of, you know, concepts, or concepts themselves, the interlocutors of your, or the characters in your stories, a la Andrew Goldman and Claire McCormack, whether comics can actually take part in the scientific process, kind of make us think about narrative, what the power of narrative is in re-examining our understanding and raising new questions.
Wow, yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, I would never be as bold as suggested, but I think, yeah, of course, yeah, I assume storytelling and character is something also you probably deal a lot with in history of science, like how do you tell the story of a certain field. And yeah, I also don't mean to suggest like we always need storytelling, like I think it really helps, but yeah, sometimes it's hard. And yeah, it's also true, like not every comic needs a character or a story, like there can be explainer comics. Also to your, like you mentioned poetry, and like, you know, I spent a lot of time also trying to define what comics are, and like nobody agrees. Like, do comics actually need words, or you can have like a completely silent, purely visual comic, and then it's more about the interplay of different images. But yeah, when it comes to the idea of, you're saying like if they can kind of, I think if I'm hearing correctly, is like, can you use comics or visual in general to like kind of process, maybe like new tools, new ideas, like, and yeah, for sure. I think that's what already we do all the time in science with like diagrams and graphic abstract. We try to like summarize everything down to one figure, which to me looks very much like a comic. And often I find that scientists, yeah, like it gives you a new understanding if you try to condense it all down on one figure. So yeah, I definitely encourage everybody. Also, when I work with scientists, I always ask them, like, why don't you sketch it first? Like, it doesn't matter. And when I also do workshop, like, it doesn't matter if you're good at drawing. It's more about this visual thinking process, I think, more than the drawing itself. That's the really useful part.
So this question's for Paul. I think Nori articulated it much better than I'm about to, but I give you a chance to answer the question. Do you think your ideas and approach is just exactly antithetical to ecological vision, a la Gibson?
I know you're a great fan of Gibson, Mike, so I don't want to say yes, but I mean, I don't want to say no, but wait, I can't remember what. Basically, I do think it's antithetical on a fundamental level. Sure. So Gibson's ecological approach, and there's many levels at which this can be framed. So one is, to the extent that we're not building up a veridical 3D map of the world. So Nori's point, really what you want to focus on is an organism's ability to interact with the world, right? And so you're building up some sort of, and then this gets difficult because Gibson wants a model, but you know. Some sort of affordances, some sort of something about the world that enables it to effectively interact. And so it's very much focused on interaction and movement and those kinds of concerns. My focus is traditionally been very much on the kind of the Euler-ish approach, right? Which is a single person sat in a laboratory with a random dot stereogram in darkness, which many people see as highly artificial, but on the other hand, I'd say, well, look, you know, you really do have what feel like the beginnings of building blocks just in that case, right? You've got people on a bike bar, they can't move at all. It's very abstracted. Certainly Gibson himself didn't give much weight to stereo vision, right? There's virtually no discussions of binocular vision. And yet there's something beautiful and profound in a very simple random dot stereogram in darkness. And so if I can start from that starting point and build that into a model of a richer model of vision in the everyday world, which ultimately is both Gibson's intention and mine, then yeah, I'd like to see that. But it may be that ultimately Gibson wins. So
I'll put my money on that.
Thank you for both. I love the talks, but I have a specific question for Paul. So in philosophy, there's a view that we perceive things from an anchored position. For example, I perceive this chair is here from the point of view of my body here at this position, right? So that's an anchored way. Well, I'm imagining that you can shape your perspective from imagining you're in a different position. So you perceive things from a different perspective, located in a specific position, right? So when you talk about the movie case, like, you don't see real world things in the movie, but it seems like you can imagine you are standing in the position at the camera that they use to record the things. Then I think that's for sure, that's not direct vision, that's more like imaginative vision. But I wonder what you would say about this kind of imaginative perspective shaping case. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty plausible account. If I'm being honest, it's not the area I've focused on as much, because I feel a lot of the 3D vision literature is already there, right? Maybe less in the kind of size and distance, more in the 3D shape. A lot of this work came from frustrations of going to conferences, sitting through hours and hours on 3D, and everything was just pictures on screens, right? And I was like, well, this is meant to be explaining the 3D world that we inhabit, we live in, which at least gives some credence to sort of Mike's point, right? Because Gibson was also pushing against pictures. But yeah, exactly. How do pictures work is a fantastic and very valuable question. But I would see it as not the question that I'm engaged in.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank both our panelists for this beautiful work. Thank you. We have a few minutes left for some general discussion of the program. Carol is going to wind up, but since we've got a lot of people in the room who've participated in the program, who've in one way or another participated in discussions, been mentors and so forth, we thought it might be helpful just to have a few minutes general discussion of how we might move forward, what was valuable, what did work, what didn't work in the program, future possibilities for collaborations in Colombia. Let me say one thing right at the start. I think I speak for many of the mentors in saying that we've learned much more from our mentees than they have learned from us. The various scholars who actually, I think, influenced the research direction of a lot of people in this university across a lot of different departments, and that's part of the contribution of the program, certainly not only the benefits for the scholars, but I think just a few minutes, if anybody's got any particular comments on any particular aspects of the program, good or critical, be very interesting to hear them. Things we could build on, things we could take into account for the future. Any remarks or comments, especially for many mentors who are here. Or indeed from scholars too, but yeah, please, there's a comment there, go ahead, yeah.
No, thanks so much for really an amazing day. I've been thinking a lot about the conversations we've had, and also both in the room and outside the room. And I remember many nights walking back with Andrew to our apartments and thinking, what just happened in a dinner, for instance? Because there's you need a lot of neuroplasticity to be able, or not plasticity, I'm using that metaphorically, but you need to be really kind of quick and responsive to code switch between disciplines. And we would hear and see people not hearing and not seeing other people in the room. Sometimes they do catch different things. Yep. And so there's this kind of like almost the experience of catching what we do know and a sea of what we don't know, and then formulating and thinking and then building meaning out of that. So there's just so much as an experience, interdisciplinariness, multidisciplinariness, transdisciplinariness, comparative disciplinariness is quite exhausting. So I find that as I'm aging, I have less stamina, but that training is still there. So I'm just more of a response and observation. If others share that, yeah.
Yeah, Andrew, please.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Linton. Yeah, and just to second that, and that's one of the distinct experiences I remember from this program coming in 2015 to 2018. I personally felt even then, in that short period of time, a certain arc of warming, that the dinner conversations, I think, in some cases, frankly, were quite contentious. And then by the third year, seemed to be, even in that short period of time, quite a bit more constructive and with a better ability to communicate. And I was struck by that change, and just look for ways to, whatever is necessary. Is it the code switching? Is it the respect? Is it the allowing space? Something, but that there was a skill there that it's hard to identify exactly what it was, but I feel like it could be practiced.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Sort of to follow up on that, and I was considering whether or not even to share these experiences, but now I think I will. Interdisciplinarity is particularly challenging for individuals who spend their whole careers monodisciplinarily. And it is not so easy as having a dictionary where you can translate even completely different conceptual frameworks, to take a sort of Carnapian viewpoint on this. And it produces scholars who are conceptually captured and locked in certain ways. At one fly out I had, a psychologist said to me, "Do you even know any psychology?" At another fly out I had, a professor of philosophy said to my face, "We don't do your kind of philosophy of science here at this university." At another philosophy fly out, the chair of the department said, "You are bad at philosophy." These are comments that follow on from having a kind of conceptual capture where they're unable to appreciate an interdisciplinarily styled way of tackling complex topics. They were also very ill-intentioned as well as being ill-informed. So I think that what the program had an aim of doing is important, but it's one I wish I could port to all the other programs that, pay lip service to interdisciplinarity. But nonetheless, these scholars in those programs are very fenced in and are unable to appreciate a diversity in the conceptual approaches to the various topics that the scholars engaged in their research in.
Yeah, I think that in terms of learning so much from the mentees, I think the mentors really learn from each other too. And
That's true too, yeah.
the big question about a postdoc program is how do, what kind of footprint does it leave at the institution? And I think that that's one of the big footprints. I mean, I think that the cognitive science major probably came out of that as well. But also, I think that the footprint is, also simply left by what you said, Andrew, that there is an openness or a skill that develops about conversing from different conceptual foundations. And it's true that that is a practical skill that has to develop. And I think that I noticed that too. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd make two. I'd make two comments. One is I think people vastly underestimate the benefits for their own research of reaching out to other disciplines. The most fruitful year I ever spent was 83-4 in the Center for Advanced and Behavioral Sciences, CSBS, up the hill in Stanford, when there was a lot of free time, and exactly as Andrew said, conversations over lunch were absolutely crucial, more important probably than any other particular seminar. The other thing I think we need to think about, especially for those of you who are in faculty positions, is we have to do the politics to advance cross-disciplinary work. So I have the misfortune to be chair of department at the moment, but chairs of departments have a lot of freedom in how resources get allocated. There's lots of things we can do if we want to build up connections with other departments. Philosophy is intrinsically interdisciplinary, perhaps in a way that other disciplines aren't. I mean, almost every great philosopher was good at something else before they became a philosopher. Very few. There's no such thing actually as pure philosophy. But it's worth putting in the work to build up these connections over time. And Pamela is right. We've left a footprint. We don't want this footprint to just be erased with the tides of time. We've all got ideas that probably come from these programs. I'd encourage people to try and do joint courses, joint seminars, discussion groups with other people in other departments. As you all know, this is an incredibly difficult time for universities in the United States. But not everything needs money. These conversations don't need money. They just need time. They just need interaction. And the program is an inspiration. And let me thank Pamela especially for the incredible amount of work that went into it. I know there's a lot of work. Thank you so much. Let me applaud for that.